I'm pregnant. Those two words, spoken in a voice trembling with both excitement and fear, should have been the happiest moment of my life. Instead, they became the beginning of an unraveling, a betrayal so deep it left me questioning everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and myself. My fiancée, Vivienne, stood there in our tiny kitchen, her hands clasped tightly over her abdomen as though shielding something precious from harm. But what she was really shielding wasn't a baby. It was a lie, a calculated deception meant to trap me into marriage. It's strange how moments like these freeze time. One second I'm sipping coffee, scrolling through emails on my phone, thinking about weekend plans. The next, the world tilts on its axis, and all you can do is stare at the person across from you, wondering if this is still the same woman who once whispered dreams of forever into your ear. Vivienne had always been magnetic. Her laugh could light up even the darkest corners of my soul, and her touch carried a warmth that made me believe in happily ever afters again after years of cynicism. We met 3 years ago at a mutual friend's birthday party, where she walked in wearing a dress that shimmered like stardust under the dim lights. She caught my eye immediately, not just because of her beauty, but because of the way she moved through the room, exuding confidence without arrogance. When she finally approached me later that night, asking if I'd mind sharing my table since hers was too crowded, I didn't hesitate. That simple request turned into hours of conversation, laughter, and shared glances that lingered just long enough to hint at something more. By the end of the evening, we exchanged numbers, promising to meet for coffee soon. And when soon came, neither of us looked back. Our relationship blossomed quickly, fueled by late-night talks about childhood memories, inside jokes only we understood, like calling rainstorms nature's mood lighting, and spontaneous road trips to nowhere in particular. Every milestone felt monumental. The first time she cooked dinner for me, burnt pasta, but somehow perfect. The day she introduced me to her eccentric family. The moment she slipped a key to her apartment onto my keychain with a shy smile. But beneath the surface of those idyllic moments, there were subtle signs I chose to ignore. Vivienne's need for control, for instance, how she insisted on planning every detail of our dates, or grew uneasy whenever I mentioned traveling alone for work. At the time, I chalked it up to quirks, harmless traits that added texture to our dynamic. Looking back now, I realize those were red flags waving furiously, warning me of storms ahead. Still, none of that prepared me for the bombshell she dropped that morning in the kitchen. As she announced her supposed pregnancy, tears brimming in her eyes, I felt my chest tighten. A million thoughts raced through my mind. Was I ready? Could we afford this? Did I want children at all? But amidst the chaos, one question burned brighter than the rest. Why did something feel off? If you're enjoying this story so far and want to dive deeper into the twists and turns of love, heartbreak, and redemption, don't forget to hit that like button below. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or predictions. I'd love to hear what you think will happen next. And make sure to subscribe for more emotionally gripping tales like this one. Now, let's rewind a little further, to the days before the lie, when Vivienne and I were still untainted by mistrust, and our love seemed unshakable. It's important to understand what we had, not just to see what was lost, but to grasp why losing it hurt so much. Our connection went beyond the ordinary. There was a rhythm to us, a cadence that felt almost musical. On Sundays, we'd spend hours cooking together, experimenting with recipes neither of us fully understood. Once, we attempted making croissants from scratch, only to end up covered in flour and laughing until our sides ached. Another ritual involved Friday movie nights, where we'd snuggle under a blanket fort we built out of couch cushions and pillows, watching old black and white films while eating popcorn drenched in butter. Even the smallest things held meaning, like how Vivienne would always steal the last piece of toast in the morning, leaving behind a playful note saying, "You snooze, you lose," or how I'd tease her relentlessly about her obsession with true crime podcasts, calling her Detective Vivi whenever she tried to solve cases aloud. These moments weren't just routines. They were threads weaving us closer together, creating a tapestry of shared experiences that defined us. And then there were the dreams. Oh, the dreams. Vivienne wanted to open her own boutique someday, a cozy little shop filled with vintage finds and handmade treasures. She'd sketched designs in a notebook she kept tucked away in her bedside drawer, showing them to me late at night when inspiration struck. In turn, I dreamed of writing a novel, a sweeping epic inspired by the places we traveled and the people we met along the way. Together, we imagined a future where weekends were spent exploring flea markets, evenings were reserved for quiet dinners at home, and holidays were celebrated surrounded by friends and family. But dreams are fragile things, easily shattered by reality. As much as I wanted to believe in ours, cracks began forming long before Vivian uttered those fateful words. They started small, an unanswered text here, a missed call there. Then came the excuses. "I've been swamped at work," she'd say, or "I needed some space to clear my head." At first, I accepted them without question, chalking it up to stress or exhaustion. But over time, the distance between us grew palpable, like a shadow creeping silently into the corners of our lives. Looking back, I can pinpoint the exact moment doubt crept in. It was during one of our Sunday brunches, a tradition we hadn't skipped in months. Vivienne sat across from me, picking at her pancakes with disinterest, her gaze distant. When I asked if something was wrong, she forced a smile and said, "Nothing, just tired." But her tone lacked conviction, and her eyes avoided mine. For the first time, I wondered if the woman sitting across from me was someone I truly knew, or merely someone I thought I did. Little did I know the answer to that question would come sooner, and more painfully, than I ever anticipated. It started with the little things, those almost imperceptible shifts that on their own might have seemed insignificant. But when pieced together, they formed a mosaic of unease, one I couldn't ignore no matter how hard I tried. Vivienne's announcement about her pregnancy should have been a joyous occasion, yet it hung over us like an ominous cloud, casting shadows where there used to be sunlight. Something in her demeanor felt off. Not the radiant glow of expectancy, but a brittle tension, as though she were bracing for impact rather than celebrating new life. At first, I chalked it up to nerves. After all, parenthood is a monumental leap into the unknown, and maybe Vivienne was simply grappling with the weight of what lay ahead. I told myself this repeatedly, clinging to logic like a lifeline while my gut screamed otherwise. Still, I played along, attending doctor's appointments and researching baby names late at night, trying desperately to convince myself, and perhaps her, that we were ready for this next chapter. But then came the inconsistencies. One evening, after returning home from work, I found Vivienne sitting cross-legged on the couch, scrolling through her phone. Her expression was unreadable, her posture rigid. When I asked if everything was okay, she glanced up briefly before muttering, "Just tired." Yet her eyes betrayed her words. They darted away too quickly, avoiding mine altogether. Later that week, during another prenatal visit, the nurse mentioned scheduling an ultrasound for the following month. Vivienne hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "Actually," she said softly, "can we push it back? I've been so busy lately." Busy? With what? She hadn't taken on extra projects at work, nor had she mentioned any other commitments. The excuse rang hollow, echoing against the walls of doubt already forming in my mind. And then there was the missed period, or lack thereof. I didn't notice it right away. Between juggling deadlines at my job and preparing for the supposed arrival of our child, I barely paid attention to the calendar. But one night, as I rummaged through the bathroom cabinet looking for aspirin, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. A box of tampons tucked behind a row of toiletries. My heart sank as realization dawned. If Vivienne truly were pregnant, why would she need these? Confrontation wasn't my strong suit. I preferred calm conversations over explosive arguments, but I knew I couldn't let this slide. That same evening, after dinner, I approached her cautiously. "Hey, Vivi," I began, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. "Can we talk about something?" She looked up from the book she'd been pretending to read, her smile faltering slightly. "Of course. What's on your mind?" I held up the tampon box, watching as her face drained of color. For a moment, silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Then, finally, she spoke. "It's not what you think," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Then explain it to me," I replied, my tone sharper than intended, "because right now it feels like you've been lying to me." Her response was evasive, filled with half-truths and deflections. She claimed the tampons belonged to a friend who'd stayed over weeks ago, insisting she hadn't thought to throw them out. But her explanations only deepened my suspicion. Why lie about something so trivial unless there was more at stake? As days turned into weeks, the distance between us grew palpable. Conversations became stilted, punctuated by long silences neither of us dared to break. Vivienne threw herself into work, staying late at the office and claiming exhaustion whenever I suggested spending time together. Meanwhile, I retreated into myself, replaying every interaction, dissecting every word, searching for answers that refused to surface. The breaking point came during a family dinner at my parents' house. Vivienne had been unusually quiet throughout the meal, picking at her food while offering vague responses to questions about the baby. At one point, my mother leaned across the table, her eyes twinkling with excitement. "Have you two thought about names yet?" she asked. Vivienne froze, her fork hovering mid-air. Beside her, I felt my stomach twist into knots. Before she could respond, I interjected hastily, "We're still deciding. It's harder than it looks." My mother laughed, oblivious to the tension simmering beneath the surface. But Vivienne's reaction, or lack thereof, spoke volumes. Her forced smile didn't reach her eyes, and her hands trembled ever so slightly as she set down her utensils. That night, as we drove home in silence, I finally confronted her. "Why did you lie to me, Vivi?" I demanded, my voice raw with emotion. "If you're not pregnant, just tell me. Whatever it is, we can figure it out together." For a brief moment, I thought she might confess. Tears welled in her eyes, and she opened her mouth as if to speak. But then she shook her head, her resolve hardening. "You wouldn't understand," she muttered, staring straight ahead. "Try me," I shot back, gripping the steering wheel tighter, because right now I feel like I don't know you at all. The rest of the ride passed in tense silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. By the time we reached home, the air between us was thick with unspoken accusations and unresolved pain. We went to bed without another word, the chasm between us wider than ever. In the weeks that followed, denial became our default mode. We continued going through the motions, attending appointments, discussing nursery designs, even hosting a small baby shower organized by Vivienne's sister. But the cracks in our foundation were impossible to ignore. Our once effortless connection had fractured, replaced by awkward exchanges and fleeting glances that hinted at deeper turmoil. Yet amidst the chaos, moments of hope flickered like candlelight in a storm. There were nights when Vivienne would curl up beside me, her head resting on my chest as though seeking solace. Other times she'd surprise me with gestures reminiscent of the woman I fell in love with, a handwritten note tucked into my bag, a playlist curated specifically for me, a spontaneous hug that lingered longer than expected. These glimpses of the old Vivienne kept me tethered, fueling my belief that we could salvage what remained of our relationship. But deep down, I knew the truth. Until she faced whatever demons drove her to deceive me, healing would remain elusive. The cracks in our relationship widened with each passing day, until the space between us felt like an unbridgeable chasm. What had once been a sanctuary of shared laughter and whispered dreams now felt suffocating. A house filled with echoes of what we used to be. Vivienne and I were still living under the same roof, but emotionally, we existed on separate planets. Our conversations dwindled to perfunctory exchanges about groceries or bills, devoid of warmth or intimacy. Even when we sat inches apart on the couch, the silence between us was deafening, heavy with everything left unsaid. I tried to reach her. Truly, I did. One evening, after weeks of strained interactions, I mustered the courage to sit her down for a heart-to-heart. "Vivi," I began, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound calm. "We can't keep going like this. Something's wrong, and it's tearing us apart. Please, talk to me." Her eyes met mine briefly before darting away, as though she couldn't bear to hold my gaze. For a moment, I thought she might open up, might finally let me in on whatever battle she was fighting alone. Instead, she shrugged dismissively. "It's nothing you need to worry about," she said, her tone clipped. "I'm fine." But she wasn't fine, not by a long shot. And neither was I. The emotional distance between us manifested in subtle yet devastating ways. Vivienne stopped laughing at my jokes, her smiles becoming mechanical and forced. She no longer reached for my hand during walks or leaned into me when watching TV. The little rituals that once defined us, The Sunday brunches, the Friday movie nights fell by the wayside, replaced by empty routines that left both of us feeling lonelier than ever. And then there were the misunderstandings, born not out of malice but from sheer miscommunication. One night, I came home late from work, exhausted and frustrated after a particularly grueling day. When I walked into the kitchen, I found Vivian sitting at the table, staring blankly at her phone. Without thinking, I snapped, "Why are you just sitting here? Dinner isn't even started." Her head jerked up, surprise quickly giving way to anger. "Excuse me," she shot back, her voice sharp. "Maybe if you didn't work yourself into the ground every single day, we wouldn't have these problems." My jaw tightened as resentment bubbled to the surface. "Oh, so now it's my fault. You're the one who's been distant and distracted for weeks. How am I supposed to fix things when you won't even tell me what's wrong?" Her chair scraped against the floor as she stood abruptly, her face flushed with fury. "You wouldn't understand," she spat, echoing the same infuriating response she'd given me countless times before. "Then help me understand," I shouted, throwing my hands up in exasperation. "Stop shutting me out." For a moment, we stood there glaring at each other, the air crackling with unresolved tension. Then, without another word, Vivian stormed out of the room, leaving me standing alone amidst the wreckage of yet another failed attempt at connection. What hurt most wasn't the argument itself. It was the realization that we were no longer fighting to resolve issues. We were fighting because we didn't know how to stop. Each confrontation drove us further apart, creating new wounds while reopening old ones. The love we once shared hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had become buried beneath layers of frustration, mistrust, and unspoken fears. To make matters worse, external forces began creeping into our fragile dynamic. A colleague of mine, Rowan, started paying more attention to me than usual. At first it was innocent enough, a compliment here, a casual invitation to grab coffee there. But over time, his gestures grew bolder, bordering on flirtatious. He'd linger too long during conversations, his hand brushing mine accidentally as he handed me documents. Once, after a particularly stressful meeting, he offered to take me out for drinks, saying, "You look like you could use someone who actually listens." Part of me wanted to push him away, to remind myself that I was engaged and committed to fixing things with Vivienne. But another part, a darker, more vulnerable part, found comfort in the attention. Rowan's presence was a temporary escape from the chaos at home, a reminder that I was still desirable, still worth pursuing. Meanwhile, Vivian seemed equally distracted by someone else, her childhood friend Delaney, who suddenly reappeared in her life after years of absence. They spent hours texting and talking on the phone, their conversations hushed and secretive. On several occasions, I caught glimpses of messages on her screen, nothing overtly suspicious, but enough to plant seeds of doubt in my already fragile mind. Was she confiding in Delaney about our struggles? Or was there something more going on? The jealousy gnawed at me, twisting my thoughts into knots. I hated myself for feeling this way, for letting insecurity creep in and poison what little trust remained. Yet I couldn't shake the fear that Vivian might find solace, or worse, affection, with someone else. One particularly brutal night, the tension reached its breaking point. We'd been invited to a mutual friend's wedding, an event neither of us particularly wanted to attend, but felt obligated to endure. Throughout the evening, Vivian barely acknowledged my presence, instead spending most of her time chatting animatedly with Delaney. Watching them laugh together, heads tilted close in conspiratorial whispers, sent a spike of irrational anger coursing through me. During the reception, as couples swayed to the music and champagne flowed freely, I approached Vivienne, my patience worn paper thin. "Can we go home?" I asked tersely, trying to mask my irritation. She frowned, clearly annoyed. "We just got here. Why don't you enjoy yourself for once instead of being such a buzzkill?" Her words stung, igniting a firestorm of pent-up emotions. "Oh, I'm the buzzkill. Funny, because last I checked, you've been avoiding me like the plague for weeks." Several guests turned to stare, their expressions a mix of discomfort and curiosity. Vivian's cheeks flushed crimson as she grabbed my arm and dragged me outside, her grip surprisingly strong. "What is wrong with you?" she hissed once we were alone, her voice low but venomous. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing you are right now?" Embarrassing? Really? That's rich coming from someone who lied about being pregnant. I shot back, my voice rising despite her attempts to shush me. Her face paled, and for a split second guilt flickered in her eyes, but it vanished almost instantly, replaced by cold defiance. "You don't get to throw that in my face," she said icily. "Not when you're too busy flirting with your coworker to notice anything else." The accusation hit like a punch to the gut. "So that's what this is about? You think I'm interested in Rowan?" "I don't think I know," she retorted, crossing her arms defensively. "Everyone sees it, including me, so why don't you just admit it and save us both the trouble?" Her words cut deeper than any blade ever could. In that moment, I realized how far gone we truly were. The woman standing before me was a stranger, her eyes clouded with suspicion and bitterness. Gone was the vivacious spirit who once lit up my world. In her place stood someone hardened and unreachable. Unable to respond, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the cool night air. As I drove home, tears streaming down my face, I couldn't help but wonder, was this really the end? Had we reached a point of no return? It's strange how life has a way of forcing clarity in moments of chaos. That night, after leaving Vivian standing alone outside the wedding venue, I drove home with my mind racing, a storm of anger, hurt, and confusion swirling inside me. My chest felt tight, like an invisible hand was squeezing all the air out of my lungs. I replayed our argument over and over again, dissecting every word she'd said, every accusation flung between us. But no matter how hard I tried to make sense of it, one question kept circling back, relentless and unyielding. Why? Why had she lied about being pregnant? Why did she shut me out when I needed her most? And why, despite everything, did I still care so deeply for someone who seemed determined to destroy what we had? When I arrived home, the house was dark and eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, letting the burn of alcohol momentarily distract from the ache in my chest. Sitting on the couch, I stared blankly at the wall, my thoughts spiraling until exhaustion finally took over. Sometime later, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, I woke up to the sound of keys jingling in the lock. Vivian walked in slowly, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She paused when she saw me sitting there, her face unreadable in the dim light. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We simply stood frozen, two strangers occupying the same space but worlds apart emotionally. Then, without warning, she broke down. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of emotion. Tears streamed down her face as she sank onto the armchair across from me, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "I'm so sorry." Her vulnerability caught me off guard. This wasn't the defensive, guarded Vivian I'd grown accustomed to seeing these past few weeks. This was the raw, unfiltered version of her, the one I thought I'd lost forever. Against my better judgment, I leaned forward, bracing myself for whatever she was about to say. "Tell me the truth, Vivi," I said quietly, my tone softer than I expected. "No more lies, no more half-truths. Just tell me why." She hesitated, wiping her tears with trembling hands. When she finally spoke, her words came tumbling out in a rush, as though she'd been holding them in for far too long. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't plan any of it, I swear. It started as a stupid idea, something I convinced myself would fix everything. I thought if I told you I was pregnant, it would force us to stay together, to work through our problems instead of drifting further apart." My stomach churned as realization dawned. So that's what this was about. A desperate attempt to salvage a relationship she feared losing. But even as understanding flickered within me, anger simmered just beneath the surface. "You lied to me," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside. "You manipulated me. Did you ever stop to think about how that would make me feel? About how much it would hurt?" "I know," she choked out, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "And I hate myself for it. Every day I've hated myself for doing this to you, to us. But I was scared, okay? Scared that you were slipping away from me. Scared that I wasn't enough anymore. I thought maybe if I gave you a reason to stay, you wouldn't leave." Her confession hit me like a freight train, knocking the wind out of me. All this time, I'd assumed her actions stemmed from selfishness or control, but now I saw the truth. They came from fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of inadequacy, fear of losing the person she loved most. But knowing her motivations didn't erase the pain she'd caused. If anything, it made it worse, because now I understood just how broken we both were. "What about Delaney?" I asked suddenly, the question bursting forth before I could stop it. "Is he the real reason you've been pulling away?" Her eyes widened in shock, then narrowed with indignation. "Delaney, are you serious right now? He's just a friend, an old friend who happens to actually listen when I talk. Unlike you, apparently." Her words stung, but they also rang true. How many times had I dismissed her concerns, brushed off her attempts to communicate, or retreated into my own world instead of meeting her halfway? Guilt settled heavily in my gut, adding another layer of complexity to the mess we'd created. For several minutes, we sat in silence, the weight of our shared failures pressing down on us. Finally, Vivian spoke again, her voice trembling but resolute. "I don't want to lose you," she admitted, looking directly at me for the first time in what felt like ages. "But I can't keep pretending either. This isn't working. We're not working." Her words hung in the air, sharp and final. A part of me wanted to argue, to beg her to give us another chance, but deep down I knew she was right. Our relationship had become a cycle of mistrust and resentment, each betrayal chipping away at the foundation until nothing solid remained. The next morning, I woke up to find Vivian gone. On the dining table, she'd left a note scrawled hastily on a piece of paper. "I need some time to figure things out, for both of us. Please don't follow me." Panic surged through me as I read those words, my heart pounding wildly. Where had she gone? Was this temporary, or was she walking away for good? The uncertainty gnawed at me, leaving me restless and anxious. Over the following days, I threw myself into work, using deadlines and meetings as distractions from the emptiness threatening to consume me. Friends called and texted, offering support and advice, but their well-meaning words only reminded me of how isolated I felt. Without Vivian, the world seemed duller, quieter, as though someone had turned down the volume on life itself. Then, unexpectedly, a call came that changed everything. It was Vivian's sister, Diana, her voice urgent and strained. "You need to come to the hospital," she said without preamble. "It's Vivian." My blood ran cold. "What happened?" "She collapsed earlier today," Diana explained quickly. "They're running tests now, but it doesn't look good." Without hesitation, I grabbed my keys and raced to the hospital, my mind a whirlwind of fear and dread. When I arrived, Diana met me in the waiting room, her face pale and drawn. "They found tumors," she said softly, her voice breaking. "Brain tumors. They're saying it's advanced." The room spun around me as her words sank in. Vivian, my fierce, vibrant Vivian, was sick. Terminal illness wasn't something we'd ever imagined facing, especially not now, when our relationship was already hanging by a thread. I rushed to her bedside, where she lay hooked up to machines, her frail form dwarfed by the sterile hospital sheets. Her eyes fluttered open when she heard my footsteps, and for a brief moment, relief washed over her features. "You came," she murmured weakly, reaching for my hand. "Of course I came," I replied, gripping her fingers tightly. "I'm not going anywhere." As I sat beside her, watching her struggle to stay awake, something shifted within me. The anger, the betrayal, the resentment. It all faded into the background, replaced by a single overwhelming realization. I still loved her. More than anything, I wanted to fight for her, to be there for her in whatever time we had left. But love alone couldn't fix everything. Not yet. First, we had to confront the truths we'd been avoiding. Not just about her illness, but about ourselves. The days that followed Vivian's diagnosis were a blur of hospital visits, doctor consultations, and sleepless nights. Each new piece of information felt like another blow, a reminder of how fragile life truly is and how little control we have over it. Yet amidst the chaos, something unexpected began to emerge: clarity. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I stopped running from the truth. I stopped hiding behind anger, fear, or denial, and instead faced the reality of our situation head-on. Vivian's illness forced us both to confront not only her mortality, but also the fractures in our relationship. During those long hours spent sitting by her bedside, we talked, really talked for the first time in what felt like forever. She opened up about her fears, not just of dying, but of being forgotten, of leaving behind unfinished dreams and unresolved regrets. In turn, I confessed my own insecurities, admitting how lost I'd felt during our estrangement and how much I blame myself for failing to see her pain sooner. "It wasn't your fault," she said one evening, her voice soft but firm as she reached for my hand. "I pushed you away because I didn't know how to ask for help. I thought pretending everything was fine would make it true." Her admission broke something open inside me, a dam holding back years of unspoken emotions. Tears streamed down my face as I squeezed her hand tightly, vowing silently to never let her shoulder her burdens alone again. In the weeks that followed, we embarked on a journey neither of us had anticipated, rebuilding trust while grappling with the uncertainty of her prognosis. It wasn't easy. There were moments when fear threatened to consume us, when the weight of her diagnosis loomed so heavily that breathing felt impossible. But slowly, incrementally, we found ways to reconnect, not as lovers clinging desperately to the past, but as two people determined to cherish whatever time they had left together. One afternoon, as we sat in the hospital garden, Vivian turned to me with a mischievous glint in her eye. "Remember that road trip we took last summer?" she asked, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "How could I forget? You got us lost 3 times before we finally found that diner with the world's best pie." She laughed softly, the sound like music after months of silence. "We should do it again," she said, her expression turning serious. Not the getting lost part, obviously, just go somewhere, anywhere, make some memories while we still can. Her request caught me off guard, but deep down, I knew she was right. Life, no matter how fleeting, deserved to be lived fully. So, against medical advice and logistical challenges, we planned a trip, a modest one given her condition, but meaningful nonetheless. We rented a small cabin near a lake, far removed from the sterile walls of hospitals and the relentless ticking of clocks. Those days at the lake became some of the most beautiful of our lives. We spent mornings fishing off the dock, afternoons exploring nearby trails, and evenings curled up by the fireplace, sharing stories and laughter until our sides ached. On the final night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Vivian leaned her head against my shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for this, for giving me peace." Her words brought tears to my eyes, but I managed a smile. "Thank you," I replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face, "for reminding me what love really means." Time, however, is an unforgiving force. Despite our efforts to create joy in the present, Vivian's health continued to decline. By winter, she was back in the hospital, weaker than before, but still fighting with every ounce of strength she had. One snowy evening, as I sat beside her bed, reading aloud from one of her favorite novels, she interrupted me mid-sentence. "I need you to promise me something," she said, her voice barely audible above the hum of machines. "Anything," I replied without hesitation. "When I'm gone," she began, pausing to gather her breath. "Don't stop living. Don't let grief keep you trapped in the past. Promise me you'll find happiness again, even if it's not with me." Her request shattered me, but I nodded through my tears. "I promise," I choked out, clutching her hand tightly. "But you're not going anywhere yet. Not tonight, not tomorrow." She smiled faintly, her eyes closing as exhaustion claimed her. That night marked the beginning of the end, a slow, painful unraveling that tested every fiber of my being. When Vivian passed away 2 weeks later, surrounded by loved ones and bathed in soft candlelight, I felt as though a part of me died with her. In the months that followed, grief consumed me. Days blurred into nights, each one heavier than the last. Yet even in the depths of despair, Vivian's final wish echoed in my mind: find happiness again. At first, the idea seemed impossible. How could I move forward without her? How could anyone else measure up to the love we'd shared? But healing isn't linear, and neither is growth. Slowly, I began to rediscover pieces of myself I'd lost along the way. The writer who once dreamed of crafting epic tales, the adventurer who craved exploration, the friend who valued connection above all else. I started journaling, pouring my emotions onto paper in hopes of making sense of them. I reconnected with old friends, leaning on their support during dark times. And eventually, I returned to the places Vivienne and I had loved together, not to mourn what was lost, but to celebrate what had been. One spring afternoon, while hiking a trail we'd visited during happier times, I stumbled upon a patch of wildflowers blooming defiantly against the rocky terrain. They reminded me of Vivienne, resilient, vibrant, unforgettable. As I knelt to take a closer look, I realized something profound. Love doesn't die when someone leaves. It transforms. It becomes a part of you, shaping who you are and guiding you toward the future. That realization changed everything. While I'll always carry Vivian in my heart, I've come to understand that honoring her memory means embracing life fully, loving deeply, laughing often, and finding beauty in imperfection. And so, here I am today, scarred but whole, heartbroken but hopeful. Love taught me many lessons, but perhaps the greatest was this: even in loss, there is light, if only we have the courage to seek it.